It's interesting to note some towns retain their original character with little changing save for the modernization that comes with the passages of time. Other towns change so much that within the span of 20, 30, or even 40 years, their own longtime residents don't recognize it anymore. Hey sightseers, Sightseeing Sally here. Marty's back there in the truck. Don't know if he'll be joining me out here because it's a little bit brisk this morning. I don't even think it's hit 50 degrees yet. For those of you who don't know, we're making our way back to Wisconsin. We stopped off in Roswell and dived into some forgotten history there and decided since we were here, we would take a drive down Highway 2, that's New Mexico Highway 2, and explore some of the more off-the-beaten, hole-in-the-wall type communities down here. You know, the type of forgotten towns that tourists don't normally go to, and see what we could find as far as history and just what life is generally like out here. I will say that yesterday we came out here to film and ended up spending most of our time talking with some of the locals. We talked with the town clerk for quite a while, and we ended up meeting a couple who graciously invited us into their home, and we were able to film some of that. Their home is fairly historic, probably one of the oldest homes still standing here in town. That was really cool. We got some insights on some of the buildings here, some of the local history. Right now I'm standing in the town park. As you can see, Marty was having a grand old time playing on the merry-go-round yesterday. We learned that the town clerk had put in for a grant, a one-time grant to make upgrades to the park here. I hope they get it. I remember what it was like as a kid, and having places to go play were quite important back then. I imagine that's still the same for kids today, and it really would just be a nice thing for the community overall. In my opinion, some might not agree. That, by the way, was the town clerk driving through. We haven't even been here more than a day, and we're already making friends. That's one of the things I love about going to some of these small communities, these small towns, is just meeting the people, and that to me is really what it's all about, the relationships you develop. But I digress. I'm blabbing on at the mouth when in reality all you want to do is see what's here. So let's move on. But before we move on, I just want you to listen for a second. You hear the birds? They're just singing away this morning. What a beautiful noise to hear. So quickly, just to cover a little bit of Lake Arthur history, one of the things you'll note if you Google Lake Arthur is there really isn't a whole lot about the town's history online. Most of this I got from talking with the people here and what I learned when I was digging into Roswell's history. Back in the day when Sheriff Garrett, you remember him, he was the guy that killed Billy the Kid. He was here, and because of him and like the likes of John Chisholm and some other historical characters, they were in the process of creating some canals, and then of course the railroad was being put in from Carlsbad, which back then was known as Eddy, up to Roswell. And because of that, these towns along the way sprung up. You have Artesia to the south, which is a lot larger and more of a tourist area than Lake Arthur. Then you have Lake Arthur, and then there's Dexter, which if you were watching, you just saw the video on that. And then there's also this other town in between, and I always forget the name of it. What is it again? That's right, it's Hagerman, and we're going to Hagerman next. We're going to make a combination video between Lake Arthur and Hagerman, because between the two, there really just isn't a whole lot for one video. In front of me, you can see the remains of an old church. It's the old Baptist church, and the church itself was built, I think, in the early 1900s. From what I was told by one of the locals, it has a rather unique feature inside. Something that you don't normally see, and that is the baptismal font is actually built into the floor. I'm not an expert on church architecture, but generally speaking, you don't normally see that. Usually the baptismal font is up on a stand, and you normally have the person or the child kind of over the stand, and then they do the water and all that. But this church has the baptismal font down in the floor. And when I was talking to one of the locals, she told me this rather interesting story about her as a child. Because it was in the floor, she thought it was the neatest thing to be baptized. So she had herself baptized like 3 or 4 times. As many times as she was allowed before they wouldn't baptize her down in the baptismal font anymore. I just thought that was one of the neatest memories, and I really appreciated her sharing that with me.
Interesting enough, it says, people of that way. I wonder what that way means.
Looks like the bell, the original bell, is probably still in the tower, don't you think?
Yeah, by looking at it, you can see nobody sawed a hole in it yet and stole it, so it must be still in there.
I like the 3 crosses that they have stationed there. That's pretty neat. And then across the street from the church is the neighborhood watch system. Pretty much anywhere you go in town, you're going to hear barking dogs. I've found that down, at least in this part of New Mexico, pretty much every house has at least a dog, if not multiple dogs, and they all get triggered by seeing somebody in their area. Which is why Mocha's hanging out in the truck with Marty, because the last thing we need on our hands is a beagle bellowing so loud that the entire town hears her and we get bounced out. Up ahead, you can see another church that's now sitting empty. It's the old First Methodist Church. If you look up, you can see it still has the stained glass windows intact. From what I understand from talking with the town clerk, there's only one church left active in town. If I remember correctly, it's the Spanish Catholic Church. Otherwise, for those locals looking to attend church services, they have to go to another town in order to do that. From what I understand, back in the day, there was probably about 1,000 people that made Lake Arthur their home. Now, I think it's less than 500, maybe 400 or so. Don't quote me on that. I tried looking up the population online, and I got a varied number of responses on that. Plus, it is early. I got up super early and didn't have any coffee yet, so we're not running on full gears yet. Just saying. Now, further down the street, if you look off way in the distance, you might see a tall white thing in the middle of the road. We'll get to that. Interestingly enough, it happens to be on the National Register of Historic Places, of all things. And what it is that it's a marker for the Ozark Trail. Before Route 66 or the federal highway system, there was the Ozark Trail. The brainchild of Arkansas's William Coyne Harvey, the Ozark Trails Association was initially formed in 1913 with the intent of making Monte Nay, a resort owned by Harvey, accessible to people in surrounding states via a network of roads designated along an official route. Though the route eventually aligned St. Louis to Las Vegas, the Ozark Trail quickly fell by the wayside with the advent of Route 66. In front of me, you can see the remains of a chimney from a house that once stood here, And then way off in the distance, you might be able to see the tower of a school. That's also a historic landmark. We'll head there a little bit later. First, I want to talk about this house here. From what I gather, it used to be a rather stately home, a beautiful piece from Lake Arthur's history. It burned down, I don't know exactly how long ago. And then across the street is this other home that's also burned. Non-related fires, of course. However, the reason I bring them up is because in talking with the town clerk, I found out from old history of Lake Arthur is that a while back, I can't really say for sure, I don't have the exact dates on it, but a while back, the town experienced another fire of some sorts, one that destroyed quite a few businesses, and the town just never recovered from that. If you were to go back in time, in a time machine, you would discover a quite different Lake Arthur. Longtime residents, ones that have been here since the beginning of their time, probably can tell you that Lake Arthur looked very different and was quite a quaint little town back in its day. Not to say anything negative about Lake Arthur as it is today, just that the old timers would tell you that they remember a different Lake Arthur. For example, this corner here where you see all the cactus overgrown and the trees, there used to stand a home owned by a woman whose last name was Flowers, so everybody knew it as the Flowers place. And apparently she loved gardening and had flowers growing all over the place. And you know how it is as a kid. When you hear something, you think one thing because you don't really understand what it really is. That's the case. The one local I talked to said growing up, she always knew it as the Flowers home, but because the woman grew flowers, she thought it was called that because of all the flowers growing there. She didn't realize that the woman's last name was really Flowers. That is, until her mother actually explained that the woman's last name was Flowers. But what's really cool about that story is that the woman who told me it later was able to purchase that home and moved it. They moved it to a different section of town and have restored it, and that is the home that we're going to go see next. Built in 1904, the original home when it was constructed is believed to be one of the town's first, as Lake Arthur is said to have sprung up sometime in the early 1900s. Now sporting several additions, this home has been lovingly restored to its present glory by its proud owners, reusing much of the home's original fixtures and building materials. Well, that was really cool. I'm so glad that they were so gracious to allow us to see the inside and share a little bit about themselves and their home's history. Moving on, let's go check out some of the other landmarks around town. In front of me is that white obelisk I had pointed out from quite the distance away. On the National Register of Historic Places, it's my understanding that this is the only one still remaining in New Mexico, and it's probably one of 7 in the entire United States, and of them 7, this one still stands in its original location. Built in 1921, the Lake Arthur Ozark Trail's marker is located nearly in the center of town and once marked the Pecos Valley route of the Ozark Trails. The only surviving marker in New Mexico, this marker is a rare artifact of early highway development in the state. The Ozark Trail marker isn't the only historic landmark in town. Look, they even have the original public school building still standing here. And if you look up there, you can see it has the original bell. Built in 1906, the Lake Arthur Elementary School has been memorialized as being the oldest continuously used school building in the state. On the Register of Historic Places, it's an iconic piece of Lake Arthur history. This here, by the way, is the one church that's still active in the community. It's the Spanish Catholic Church I had mentioned earlier. For those of you wondering, they are trying to build up the community here. They would love it if a business would come in and open up. You know, they've got lots for sale here. I believe $1,200 is the starting price for people looking to build a new home or start a business. And don't be fooled by the appearances of their police department. They have officers who split their time between here and Hagerman, which we're headed to next. But if you think you're going to come here, cause trouble, raise a ruckus, speed through town, you'll get a ticket. Don't say I didn't warn you. They may even bounce you out, for all I know. Just know they're doing everything they can to keep this place happy, quiet, and a nice place to live for the residents. Speaking of keeping the town quiet, see what I mean about the dogs? Here's 4 of them. Oh, and a 5th one coming. I think they all want to be my friend. What do you think? What do you make of that?
I think that little black one's going to stroke out with that noise he's making.
Fortunately for us, our beagle's being awfully good back there.
Yeah, I don't even know she's behind me.
See, there's our beagle. Are you being a good girl, beagle? Now, like a lot of towns we've explored along the railroad, Lake Arthur sprung up because of the railroad being built from Eddy, which is now Carlsbad, to Roswell. This direction is where you would go to Roswell, and this way is where you would go if you were heading down to Eddy back in the day. Before you get to Carlsbad, though, there is Artesia, which I had mentioned earlier. And I guess from what I was reading, the whole reason the railroad was even put in to go from Eddy to Roswell was so that they could easily ship sugar beets down to Eddy. I was really surprised by that because I wouldn't have pictured them growing sugar beets out here. But again, the Pecos River, the Grand Pecos River, I say grand because back in the day it was a really grand river. Now it's just basically a trickle. But that river would have helped to water any of the crops that were growing down here back then. Along with the artesian wells they would have drilled. In front of me is an old gas station that would have once serviced the people in Lake Arthur. That's pretty neat. You don't see too many of those old gas pumps still standing at an old gas station like that. Usually people come along and take them
for their own personal collections.
Not like you've never owned any of them before.
They're cool.
How many did you have?
3.
Yep, when I met him, he had, I think, at least 2 of them sitting out in front of his garage.
And 1 in the back shed.
Marty the collector. A town such as Lake Arthur, lamented for the losses that have been hard to replace, too often is dismissed as a place not worth knowing. Yet, there's something special about this little hole in the wall off Highway 2 that only those fortunate enough to have stumbled upon it will understand the true value of its worth.